You're utterly hopeless as a working adult. I bet you were dumped here because you couldn't work properly at the head office. You're nothing but a nuisance. Get out. Though I intended to let the word wash over me, something within me grumbled at the branch manager's words. My name is George. From childhood, I was good at studying and graduated from a prestigious university with good grades and joined a major bank. I gained experience and have done well in my job since then. I was lucky enough to meet a wonderful woman and we got married. Our only son is full of energy and I believe that my life is going pretty well. One day, I was assigned to a certain branch. It was a branch infamous for its high number of resignations within the group, and I have heard no good rumors about it. There was a branch manager who would harass employees and wield his authority. As my colleagues at the branch severely warned me, the people dispatched from the head office are often the first targets. The branch manager immediately marked me. He dumped an overwhelming amount of work on me, made self-centered comments, blamed mistakes on others, and every day was tiresome dealing with a branch manager who took actions that were astonishingly unpleasant to people. Facing such a branch manager every day takes a lot of energy, even it's part of the job. When I got home and accidentally vented my frustrations, it must be really tough. You've worked hard. My wife, who offered a warm cup of tea, and my son's smiling face as he jumped onto my lap comforted my heart. If it's for protecting my wife and son, and this family, dealing with a couple of unreasonable people is not a big deal. It had been my motivation to work hard. However, it hurts when it affects not just me but also my family. Today was my son's kindergarten presentation, and despite having requested a leave of absence in advance, "Come to the office right now." Upon receiving the message, I let out a big sigh. Thankfully, the presentation had ended, but I had to cancel the lunch we were looking forward to. And I had to explain to my son that I had to go back right away because I couldn't ignore the call from the branch manager on our way home. My son said, "Can't be helped. It's part of your job. But you did promise." My son seemed a bit displeased, and thinking about petty reasons for the call made me feel sad for my son. However, I noticed a subtle change in my son's expression. After staring at me for a while, "Isn't that lady over there acting strange?" he said while pointing. As he pointed out, I turned around to see what happened, and I was at a loss for words. Even though it was a road with little traffic, an elderly woman staggering towards the roadway jumped into my sight. The old woman's face was dark, as if she was lost in thought and completely oblivious to her surroundings. The next moment, I saw a car speeding towards us from a distance and shouting, "Watch out!" I ran towards the old woman. I firmly grasped the old woman's arm, making sure she wouldn't fall, and pulled her away from the road. Just after that, a car sped past us. "Watch out, you're in danger!" An angry voice shouted from inside. I had been so focused on the old woman's safety that I had tripped over my own feet and fell to my knees, causing the old woman's collapse on the spot as well. Both the old woman and I were stunned for a while, but people who felt that something had happened were gradually gathering. My son ran up to me. "Dad, are you okay? What about the old lady?" He grabbed the hem of my clothes and asked. With that, I regained my composure and reassured him, saying, "I'm okay," and I patted his head. The old woman still had a shocked look on her face, and after I asked her several times if she was okay and if she was hurt, she finally looked at me. "Are you okay, ma'am? It's dangerous to rush out onto the road, you know." My son also looked up the old woman, saying worriedly, "Ah, yes, I'm okay. You stopped me, didn't you?" she said, responding to our voices and thanking me. It seemed that she was a little calmer. "I'm glad you're safe. I'm sorry for pulling you so hard. I hope you're not hurt anywhere," I said, realizing that I had thrown my bag somewhere in the rush. My bag." I looked around for my bag, and my son said, "It's over there." He pointed to my bag lying a little distance away. The documents inside her scattered a bit, and as my son and I were picking them up, the old woman also picked up a few. I'm really sorry. Thank you for helping me. Are you by any chance from Skybank? Could you tell me your name? She asked while looking at the documents. Yes, I'm George from Skybank. That's my dad. He's really nice. After the introduction, these rather embarrassing words came out of my son's mouth, and I couldn't help but smirk. Then the old woman also said, I see, he helped me out earlier too. And she was having a pleasant conversation with my son. She was cheerful now, a stark contrast to the darkness that had marked her face when she was staggering earlier. Just as I was thinking about this, the old woman took a step forward and winced slightly. I thought I was fine, but I might have twisted my ankle, she said, checking her ankle which seemed slightly swollen, so I quickly had her sit on a nearby bench. Then I said, I have my car parked nearby. I'll get it and take you to the hospital, pointing towards the nearby parking lot. At first, she said, I don't feel much pain, so I can walk. But my son kindly said, But it hurts, right? You shouldn't overdo it. She nodded in agreement with a wry smile. Afterwards, I explained the situation to my wife who was waiting in the car, took the old woman to the hospital, and then returned to the branch. As I expected, I was reprimanded by the branch manager for being late, and my explanation was ignored. The matter I was called for wasn't special, it just wasted my day off. The latter part of the day was a quite disappointing one, but I was able to watch my son's performance and help the old lady. Feeling fulfilled from the eventful day, I went to sleep. A few days later, I was again at the branch, listening to the branch manager's usual unreasonable anger. Apparently, the manager had messed up the scheduling, and for some reason, he was angry and blaming it on my communication error. Moreover, it was early after the opening, and while there were not many people around, right behind the counter. What does he plan to do if a customer walks in? Does he intend to show this behavior to the customer? Honestly, I had grown tired of even seeing this man, but I kept reminding myself to stay calm and accepted his verbal abuse. You're always complaining. I'm sick of the excuses from an incompetent like you. You're unfit to be a part of society. You're nothing but a nuisance sent over here from the head office. Just go home. Something within me that had been bearing the brunt of this under the pretense of calmness crumbled away at the manager's words. I concluded that I could not deal with this man. I looked the branch manager squarely in the eye and spoke. Understood. I will be leaving my post at this branch effective immediately. The moment I made that declaration, I heard a small tapping sound from behind. When I turned around, to my surprise, there was a customer. We had completely missed her presence due to the manager's loud yelling. It was the same elderly lady that I remembered from that day. The small sound was her cane tapping on the floor. She looked at me and said, Hello, young man. You really helped me out the other day. With a smile, then turned to the manager with a stern look. I am Mrs. Green. I was scheduled to come here this afternoon. I've been listening for a while, and it seems like you've forgotten about our appointment, Mr. Manager. At Mrs. Green's words, both the manager and I were simultaneously surprised. Ah! We both reacted with a startled. The whole lecture from the manager had been a result of mixing up the morning and afternoon schedule and blaming it on me. Who would have thought that the appointment was with Mrs. Green? I could have adjusted to either the morning or afternoon. My foot pain has mostly subsided, and as I was thinking of going for a walk, I saw a familiar face, so I walked in. Then I found you shouting loudly. From the beginning, the manager did not know that Mrs. Green and I were acquainted, and he kept his mouth open in surprise as he listened to her story. I've aged as well, but I think my memory is still okay. However, I make sure to write down the content of phone calls just in case. Look, I also have a record of my call with the manager. As she said this, Mrs. Green pulled out a note from her purse, opened it for us to see, and there, in beautiful handwriting, it read, Phone call with branch manager. Go to the bank at 1 p.m. Mr. Manager, it was undoubtedly you who I had arranged the meeting with. On that note, pushing the blame on your own memory lapse onto him, isn't that disgraceful as a professional? Confronted with undeniable evidence, the branch manager, unlike when he was yelling at me, was wide-eyed in surprise, opening and closing his mouth several times without uttering a word. She, without taking her gaze off the perplexed branch manager, pointed firmly at me. Moreover, I came here to specifically request him to be in charge of my account. If he is to leave this branch, then I have no intention of entrusting my assets to someone who shifts their responsibilities onto others. I will withdraw all of the $3 billion that I have deposited. Please prepare for that immediately. A surprising fact, Mrs. Green was actually an important major client of our Skybank. The branch manager, after hearing Mrs. Green's words, Please, anything but that. Could you reconsider your decision, I beg you?" had the look of being drained of all vitality. "I've said all I have to say. Could you please hurry up with the preparations?" But Mrs. Green was unwavering. While I had been gripping my smartphone, the branch manager, realizing that he had no means of persuading Mrs. Green himself, immediately cast a glance my way. "George, come on, trying to convince her as well. Does this man have no sense of shame?" I thought to myself as I replied. "I apologize. I've already stated that I'm leaving this branch, so I'm not in a position to intervene." I did not entertain the branch manager's request. The branch manager was sent into a panic, and Mrs. Green and I were left with no choice but to wait for him to regain his composure. Just then, the door to the bank opened, and a middle-aged man walked in. I immediately recognized the customer and bowed to him. "Thank you very much for taking the time to come here, Mr. Wilson." The branch manager gasped at my words. "What?" and stared at the customer, Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson is an executive at the head office of Skybank, and there is no way the branch manager doesn't know his name or face. But Mr. Wilson did not even look at the branch manager, and instead first directed his gaze at me. "You've had a rough time, George. It seems things are just as I heard." When I nodded and replied, "Yes," to Mr. Wilson, he turned to Mrs. Green and bowed his head. "I'm sorry for the inappropriate behavior of our employee. I sincerely apologize." Mrs. Green, who had not acknowledged him until that moment, sensed the change in an atmosphere and looked at Mr. Wilson for the first time. "And who might you be?" "I'm sorry for the abruptness, without even a proper greeting. My name is Wilson, and I am an executive at Skybank's head office. I rushed over here upon receiving a call from Mr. George." She looked at me, so I nodded, smiling, and reassured her, "It's fine. Moreover, Mr. George being here is at my instruction. Even if he were to be transferred, he will not be leaving our bank. Please, may I ask you to calm your anger? Of course, I will assign him as your representative, Mrs. Green." At Mr. Wilson's explanation, Mrs. Green seems to have generally understood the situation. She looked at me again, so I nodded, smiling, and reassured her, "It's fine." "I see. I actually intended to hand over the funds I withdrew to you. If you say it's okay, I'll leave it deposited in the bank, but if you tell me to take it, I will." I hastily shook my head in response to Mrs. Green's continued talk. I couldn't possibly accept such a large amount of money. "Yes, it would be helpful if you could do that. Thank you, and I look forward to continuing to work with you," I said, bowing to my head to Mrs. Green. On the other hand, the branch manager, completely left behind, was listening to our conversation with mixed feelings. But every time he tried to say something, he felt silent under Mr. Wilson's glare. I promised to meet Mrs. Green again later and saw her off. After that, I walked toward the branch manager, who was completely disheartened and had slumped in his seat, along with Mr. Wilson. As you probably already understand, I've sent Mr. George here for internal investigation of this branch, the constant harassment of your employees, the multiple employees who have been forced to resign because of it. All of the evidence is assembled. Accept it and wait for the results quietly. Mr. Wilson's voice echoed like thunder, leaving the branch manager completely beaten. That's right, at the request of Mr. Wilson, the executive officer, I have been sent to investigate the problems at this branch, which had a high turnover rate and a bad reputation. Just as I was about to finish my investigation, gathering evidence of the branch manager's power harassment, this incident occurred, and I immediately contacted Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson, sensing the possibility of losing a major client for the bank, happened to be nearby and came directly to me. I had no idea that Mrs. Green, the old lady, was a major client of our bank. I'm glad I knew this before I left the branch. Later, the branch manager, left behind, was cornered into an inescapable situation with the evidence I brought back, revealing various misdeeds, and while he did not resign, the number of employees who said they had been harassed was more than expected. The branch manager, who was transferred to a non-executive position, couldn't bear the cold looks and eventually resigned. I heard through the grapevine. I returned to my job at the head office. My investigation was perfectly completed. This fact was evaluated by the executives, and I started walking the path of an elite. I became friendly with Mrs. Green, our major client, and was able to ask her why she took such action that day, the day I helped her. According to Mrs. Green, her only son's family and grandchildren were moving abroad for work, but she thought it would be difficult to adapt to living abroad at her age, so she declined to go with them, but she seems to feel terribly lonely. Unable to distract from her daily loneliness, she began to think that if something happened to her, her sons might be worried and come back to America. Following that thought, she was walking unsteadily on the street, where I saved her. That seems to be the reason she had a close call that day. Even now, I'm terrified to think of what might have happened if I hadn't been there talking to my son at the time. I'm glad I was able to help her from the bottom of my heart. For Mrs. Green, too, her world changed because she was saved that day. She told me that she was ashamed to think that she had tried to cause unnecessary worry to her family because a stranger like me helped her and took her to the hospital because I was worried. Mrs. Green deeply regretted that she had been wrong to shut herself in without going out, being eaten away by loneliness. She wanted to repay me for making her realize the foolishness of her actions, so she contracted the bank. Since that day, every time I met Mrs. Green, her gloomy demeanor from that day faded, and she regained her brightness. She told me with a smile that she had started communicating with her sons, expressed her feelings directly to them, and had started going out more often. Her sons told her, "We appreciate it if you can tell us even the difficult things. We can't come home right away, but we're worried, so we'll keep in touch regularly." It seems that those words had become a support for her heart. She said to me, "But my routine hasn't changed. I'm still lonely and idle. So I would be happy if you would continue to keep an eye on me." "So, well, why don't my son and I go out somewhere together?" I suggested. Mrs. Green seemed very surprised and happy and nodded. So we decided to interact not only through work but also on a family level. As I deepened my friendship with Mrs. Green, I started to communicate with her son over the phone. He thanked me, saying, "My mother, who was left in the U.S., seems very happy recently, and that's thanks to you. Thank you." My son, who usually had little interaction with his distant grandparents, enjoyed communicating with her and got along with her as if she were his real family. We quickly hit it off with a couple who were Mrs. Green's only son and his wife. When they came back here after a long time, we started interacting as families, and Mrs. Green now no longer showed her previously gloomy face, always shows us a smile when we meet. Looking at the calm smiles of both families, I felt again the importance of human connections and vowed in my heart to cherish them as irrepressible from now on.